All right, this is very good. Eric, get that special birthday song out. You know which one I'm talking about. The one Stevie sings. Yeah, folks, this is Martin's birthday. I say Martin with no disrespect. That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But he's done so much that has affected me and you that, some of us could call him Uncle Martin or Cousin Martin. But the main thing is to call his name. Speak out. Remember that he brought some consciousness to a world that was asleep. I'm not going to give him the title of waking everybody up, but you know why? It wasn't because getting woke wasn't a good idea. It's that despite his activism and the truth of his activism and the echo of his activism, we find that people are still acting the way they acted prior to his lessons, prior to his message, prior to I don't know. I was supposed to attend an award ceremony last night, and I started getting those little shaky things, and I said, no, I'm going to take my echinacea and medicate myself and hang in here. And while I did that, there was a football game on. The L.A. Chargers were playing Jacksonville Jags, and man, L.A. took off. They were so far ahead in the game, it was just like racism in America. Yeah, racism was so far ahead that you didn't want to, at halftime, a lot of folks wanted to give up. Martin said, no, let's keep on going.
Right, that's right.
Coach Martin said, no, we got to keep on going. And guess what, Coach? Coach Allen is saying, we still got to keep on going. Because we have so many evidences of the fact that born in racism, tend to live in racism. The idea is to not die in racism. White supremacy is a concept that, I don't know, maybe if I were white, I would feel that way too. I know that as a fan of the Chargers, I have to hold my breath when they get a call against them, and I don't run out and tell the referee, hey, man, we were wrong on that one. They're going to give them we'll take a penalty. Most of us won't take a penalty, even though we know we're wrong. I understand that part. I'm not going to stand under it, however. We've got to do the right thing. We have opportunity. We have responsibility to step up and seek equity. Not because Martin did it, but because it's God's message. If you have a strength, you're supposed to use it. Don't hide it under a bushel. If you want equality, you've got to reach out for it. You've got to get up early. You've got to do your job. And you should not be penalized because of the color of your skin, whether that color is black, white, brown. We've got to deal with each other based on the spiritual essence, the goals, the standards that we set. Speaking of setting standards, we've got a group here in the state of California who is setting a standard or moving toward equity. The California Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board is a group of people that I could explain it, but I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm going to ask Steve Raphael, the co-chair of that organization, who happens to be a professor of public policy at the University of California, Berkeley, to come in and talk to us a little about that. And Steve, I'd like for you to know that we have my good friend Joe Richardson here. He is a civil rights attorney. He does employment, civil rights,
equity-related stuff.
Yes,
yeah.
And I don't know. He's been a little resistant to my getting him to form the organization that's going to go out here and become a nonprofit, profit-oriented group that seeks out those who have been deprived of their rights. Not just wait, but become an anti-bigot. Not just an observer that says, well, I'm not in it, I'm not a bigot, so I'm doing well. No, we're going to be anti-bigots. We got to step up and make statements and do things that are going to help turn this racism and bigotry around. I think that is part of what, but then I'm putting words again in the mouth of my friend Steve. And Steve, how are you this morning?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me this morning.
No, no, thank you for being available. Thank you for doing your work. What is public policy? Real quick. You're a professor of public policy. Tell us about public
Sure.
policy.
Well, public policy is a broad field of study and practice that encompasses everything from understanding how the law works, understanding the functioning of local and state government, understanding international relations, and basically understanding how we set the rules that govern our society and the way that government basically interacts and tries to serve the public. So it's a very, very interdisciplinary sort of field of study. I personally am an economist that studies crime and criminal justice, but my colleagues at Berkeley and across the country who study this are from political science, from sociology, from engineering, from lots of different fields.
The concept or the statement or the definition of policy, I think, extends itself as we look into your advisory board and the racial and identity profiling advisory board, that we're looking at policy is what people have agreed to do. And you as an individual may agree with it or not, but it's the policy. The same thing as you describe this report that's based not just on the fact of a person's identity, but the perception that the police have as they. Let's let you explain that. Dear, what's the role of that board? And you guys just released a report that is not shaking people up across the state, but people like me, it's kind of reinforcing our need to come together to make a correction in policy. And
Sure.
okay.
Sure.
So let me let you explain the board.
Yeah, sure. So in
REPA Act.
2000, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. In 2016, the state passed Assembly Bill 953, which was the Racial Identity and Profiling Act. And what the act requires is, over the course of about 6 years, that every single law enforcement agency in the state collect a uniform set of information every time someone is stopped for a traffic stop, or every time somebody is stopped as the result of a call for service. And the information that's collected on every stop includes both the officer's perceived identity of the people involved in the stop, both the drivers and the passengers, but then also what happens in the stop. So are people asked to exit the vehicle? Are people sat on a curb and handcuffed? Do people get a ticket? Do they get a warning? Is there an arrest? Do they search the car? Was the car searched incident to arrest, or was it consent search? And so on and so forth. And so that database, that data collection effort started about 4 or 5 years ago, and it started in the largest law enforcement agencies in the state, so like CHP and the LAPD and so on and so forth. And the requirement to collect that information has spread to all agencies in the state. So now, as of 2023, every law enforcement agency is reporting into the RIPA program. And the report that was released is probably, I believe it's the 5th report that the Racial Identity and Profiling Act, the advisory board, has released. And it provides an analysis of the data, what is seen, and then updates from the previous year, incorporates the new agencies. And then often in the last probably 3 years, the reports have gotten more into thinking about policies for trying to address some of the issues that have been seen. So, for example, in this particular report, there's a lot of discussion about pretextual stops, right, or stops where there's some sort of reason that one could legally be stopped, but the officer seems to be stopping somebody because they have a hunch that something else is going on.
A hunch
and
stop.
It's thought by Okay, so it's thought by many to be a situation that is rife for sort of personal biases to enter into the activity.
That's where we get into the similarity of the concept of policy and perception. Policy, once again, is what we all agree to do. Perception is what I agree to do. my feelings, how I feel about it. When you have the report, when you pull together the evidence or pull back the information that a policeman collected, you spoke about perception in your report. We're going to take a short break, Steve. When we come back, let's talk about the importance of that perception as you used it to analyze and collect that information. This is Empire Talks Back. I'm Wallace Allen. Things are not as good as they're going to be, and that's because you and I are going to work today on making tomorrow better. We'll be right back after this short break as we move in that direction.
Miss your favorite show? Download the podcast at kcaaradio.com.
I'm Dr. Erica Pond with the California Department of Public Health, reminding you of ways to help stop the spread of COVID and other viruses this winter. Boost your immunity by staying up to date with COVID boosters and flu shots. Wash your hands often with soap and warm water for at least 20 seconds. Cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze. And protect others by staying home and testing for COVID when sick. More tips at covid19.ca.gov. Brought to you by CDPH.
Publish your legal notice in West Side Story newspaper. For the best service and the best rates, call 909-384-8131. Publishing legal notices in the city and county of San Bernardino since 1990. West Side Story provides friendly expert service. Call 909-384-8131 to benefit from budget-friendly rates. Whether a fictitious business name, a name change, a divorce summons, or any other legal or public notice, call West Side Story newspaper 909-384-8131. 909-384-8131. That's 909-384-8131.
This is KCAA.
All right, Martin, happy birthday to you, my brother. Just like all the rest of us on our birthday, though, you don't get everything you want. But you do get some cake, ice cream, and some good memories, and folks that care about what you've done get a chance to express that. Tomorrow morning in Riverside, there's the march. That has, I don't know, many years. I guess I should be able to tell you how many years. But the one thing I can tell you is that if you're over at the Stratton Center tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can register for the walk. It's $25, and it helps an organization that is fighting for equity. There's also the Martin Luther King breakfast in the city of San Bernardino at 909 H Street. Starts at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's where you can go and gather with other folks who have the same concerns that you do. And at noon tomorrow in San Bernardino, there'll be a Martin Luther King celebration parade. It's just west of Mount Vernon Avenue on Baseline. Yours truly will be there. I will be helping to announce the parade. But there's many things going on, and you don't have to go out and find something official. One of the best things you could do would be to call somebody that you haven't talked to and tell them that you're still concerned and you want to know how they're doing. And is there anything that you can do to support equity in their community? And there's certainly some things they can do to support equity in yours. Do you know what they are? Great. Just keep listening to the show, and I'll tell you a couple of things that you can do to support equity in your community. And it has to do with this great report that Mr. Steve Raphael is co-chair of the advisory board for, and that's the California Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board. They have a report that is based on many things. One of it is how police perceive you and why they pull you over and how often they do it based on that perception, as opposed to basing it on what we may call, what do we call it there? Cause, profiling. I mean, if there's not profiling, there's a real cause for the policeman to pull you over. Stephen, tell us a little bit about how important perception is in the gathering of information for your report.
Well, it's quite important in terms of identity. What has to be filled in about the person who stopped identity, the officers do make an assessment of what they believe the person's race or ethnicity is, and they write it down. And the legislation was quite clear that it would write down the officer's perception rather than the officer have people ask them, so one could understand if there's any relationship between those perceptions and subsequent outcomes at a stop.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, my guess, my personal belief would be that most of the time the officers are getting it right when they're guessing people's race, but there's room for error. There's
I don't
also
know.
questions.
My wife and I
Yeah.
watch TV, and a lot of times people come up on the air and just say, Daddy, what do you think they are? And I'm kind of limited to say, well, the only thing I could probably say is that they're not white.
Yeah.
And so the perception is it's not an easy thing to do, not an easy thing to have.
Right.
I had an aunt that was definitely perceived as white, and she gloried in it, and we weren't mad. But not to deflect too long, but that's part of my job. So,
Right.
Thank you, Stephen. Go on.
Yeah. So, and in addition to that as well, more about perception. There is questions in there that ask to identify people's gender and all of the different ways that could be expressed,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's questions regarding whether somebody is transgender male or transgender female, or non-binary. And again, these are things that I'm sure there might be a gap between the way the officer perceives something and how somebody might describe themselves. Although in most of the stops that we see, I think it's 99.2%, they just sort of flag male or female. Aside from that, most of the stops that are observed in the data are for traffic violations. And if there's observed traffic violation, then there's probable cause for pulling somebody over. And then, there's a large, not a large, but a small minority of stops, probably about 10%, that are for, reasonable suspicion, meaning that the officer perceives that there was a crime that's about to occur, that did occur, or that they have some sort of reason for pulling them over other than a traffic violation.
So after you guys do your report, as you analyze this information, you make recommendations.
Yes.
I'm wanting to note how often those recommendations are converted to policy, if at all, and what are your intentions as you make recommendations? And I guess to kind of stay in order, why would we have to make recommendations if progress is being made on a consistent basis? And, it's like once we're told that the road is out, there's a sinkhole there, don't drive down this road, people don't drive down that road. So once we find out that there is a disparity in how certain people are dealt with or treated as a result of police activity, and we find that there's a sinkhole of sorts, and we notify those agencies, we would expect that they would no longer have that particular problem or drive across that particular sinkhole. Give us some results of this year's report. Compare it to, if you will, a report or two from the past, and talk to me about the progress that you see as a result of the hard work that you're doing to analyze, to collect the police, the hard work they're doing to collect the information, the hard work that's involved in analyzing it, and the hopefully not frustrating work of making recommendations.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the report has a standard set of analytical results that it generates every year, for the purposes of comparison, and then there are specific areas that will be focus of not only analysis of the data from California, but revisions of research from other departments, from other states that researchers and scholars are doing, and try to make policy recommendations, sometimes small, sometimes large, that are meant to address some of the disparities that are observed in the data. So, for example, there are things that are perhaps on the smaller side. So, in many departments across the state, if one wants to file a complaint to the police department, you have to sign a form that acknowledges that if you're filing a false complaint, that's I don't know if it's a misdemeanor or a felony, but it's indicating that you're acknowledging that filing a false complaint is a crime. And that has actually been, that there's federal litigation that suggests that that's unconstitutional to require that, but some departments do. And I remember at one of the very early reports, one of the things we had recommended is that the legislature basically pass legislation that departments not include those disclaimers or those forms that people have to sign a complaint. That never happened. On the other hand, there were other instances, for example, in the years past, where we've recommended that in screening people at the academy, that their social media be reviewed as part of the hiring process to see whether there is any evidence of bias against a particular racial group or a gender group or what have you. So in the process of screening people, to use the information on what people have publicly posted in the past. And that is actually has become part of the screening process in California. Now, that's not entirely, I don't. Perhaps the board can claim credit for that. I mean, I think.
Let me interrupt you just for a second there, Joe. Does that attorney Richardson? Does that sound like a civil rights concern? People going through your social media to determine. I mean, I think it may give us some information that we want, but is that does that pull the hairs on the back of your neck at all?
It's a loaded question. I love the idea. I guess the only problem becomes there's potential to draw information from social media that you can't ask in the interview. See, there's certain things that you're not supposed to be able to ask in the interview. That's why I advise folks that if you really want to make sure that you're not judged, then you have to make sure in hiring and employment, because nobody's going to admit to you they're making a decision based on something that they couldn't ask you, but they saw from somewhere else. Okay. Social media could be one of those places. So that's a little bit of a concern there, even though, frankly, I love the idea. You have to find some way to understand whether or not there is some bias or some pre-held bias, or the extent to which that would be disqualifying. We all have pre-held biases, okay?
Absolutely.
And so, you'd have to balance that. But, yeah, I understand the idea.
So the idea of social media, once again, being evidence of something other than just communicating with your friends is something folks need to think about as they're dealing in social media. One other thing that we said that I would like to go over quickly, and that's making a police report with the newspaper. People tend to call me and ask me, do I want to do the story and the police report and how to do the police report. If you write something down, I always believe that the documentation of writing it down is strong. And to actually have to go fill out the police form is interesting, but I've always told people, write them a letter and CC the letter to every newspaper in town. And that's probably going to help you more than just the police report. I don't know, but I'd like to get a quick, how do you feel about that, Stephen? And how do you feel about that, Attorney Richardson? Because I'd like to be given good advice.
Well, I do. The early discussion that we had was primarily not necessarily around police reports, but filing a complaint. So if someone felt that they were disrespected or had excessive force used, or there was a service issue or a lack of professional conduct, you can file a complaint with your local police department. And it was the requirement that some departments had where they wanted people to sign a form indicating if you're filing a false complaint or if we find that you're filing that could be a crime. Filing a false police report, on the other hand, like if you say that there was an offense or I've been victimized, I believe that's a felony. And we weren't necessarily addressing that.
Mm-hmm.
We were more addressing the process whereby the local residents of a city can file information about their treatment by an officer in the event that they had an encounter that left them feeling like that they were treated less than respectfully, or if their rights were violated.
I just got a telepathic message from Dr. King. And he said, Wallace, ask him about the statistics. Don't bury the headline. And and we haven't talked about the statistics and with the findings, and we do want to get into some of that. Could you discuss some of the blatant, disturbing statistics, if there are any, and could you discuss any of the reassuring, happy feeling statistics, if there are any?
Sure. So there's a pretty consistent, in the last 5 reports, there's a pretty consistent set of results that we see over and over again, right? So if you look at the proportion of stops that are of black people, it's about 2.5 times the representation of black people in the California population. Latinos are stopped at a rate that is slightly higher than their representation in the population, and then white people and Asian people are stopped at rates that are slightly lower than their population. So you see this disproportionality in stops. That there's always a question about what's driving that, and so there are various ways that researchers try to test for different treatment. One of which is something that's called a hit rate analysis, and the basic idea is that if you look at the people who are searched, say, for example, and it's about 1/5 of stops involve a search, or it's actually less, it's 1/5 of African-American stops that involve a search, but somewhat lower for everybody. What the hit rate analysis does is it looks to see, well, if you're among say, black people are stopped and white people are stopped, how often do you find contraband when somebody is searched? Mm-hmm. And if you're finding that it's lower for one group than another, it suggests you're holding that group to greater scrutiny. And in the past, most of our reports has shown that there was a slightly lower hit rate among African American searches than among white searches.
I've heard,
and it was statistically significant.
I've had people, as we've discussed this at what we hoped was an intellectual level, tell me that black people get arrested more because they're doing more wrong. And it's as simple as that.
Well,
we're going to take a short break, Steve, and we'll come back. Let's see how simple that is compared to what you really find out in terms of arrest, search, and who's let go. And is that a good thing that they're letting be, you're being let go, or was it a bad thing to be stopped in the first place? We'll get on that when we get back. We're going to take this short break because I'm an old man, and I'll be right back.
There's been so many.
This is KCAA.
Wondering if you should get the updated COVID-19 booster? Here are 3 reasons why you should. 1, vaccines and boosters provide better protection from COVID-19. 2, even if you've had COVID-19 before, boosters are recommended to keep your immunity strong, especially as new variants emerge. And 3, your risk of getting very sick from COVID-19 goes up with age, and boosters can help lower the chance of hospitalization and death. Find a booster near you at myturn.ca.gov. Brought to you by the California Department of Public Health.
Publish your legal notice in West Side Story newspaper. For the best service and the best rates, call 909-384-8131. Publishing legal notices in the city and county of San Bernardino since 1990. West Side Story provides friendly expert service. Call 909-384-8131 to benefit from budget-friendly rates. Whether a fictitious business name, a name change, a divorce summons, or any other legal or public notice, call West Side Story newspaper 909-384-8131. 909-384-8131. That's 909-384-8131.
Miss your favorite show? Download the podcast at KCAAradio.com.
This is Empire Talks Back. I'm Wallace Allen, and my mother is very proud of me most of the time, but I hope she's not listening right now because I'm going to say something. You know, black people could have identity issues, good or bad, after a police stop. I can imagine that, you know, a guy pulled over that's 5'6", you know, who wish he was a little taller. He may take a little bit of esteem building when he realizes that the police pulled over a 5'6" black man because they were looking for a 6'5" black man. And I'm laughing because I don't want to cry. But those kind of things, you know, are discussed in the church, the party, the pool room where black folks gather, and those kind of things have happened. Perception, stopping people, and letting them go. Tell us a little bit about what happens when we have seen, when we look at the number of young blacks being pulled over at twice the rate. You've got one group of young blacks that are pulled over at 6 times the rate. Could you tell us a little bit about what that circumstance is?
Well, yes. So the one thing that we do see a pattern when, rather than only looking at stops where searches occur, is it's oftentimes the case that when you look at just the complete group of stops by race and ethnicity, that what happens during the stop is quite different. So, you know, black drivers are more likely to be asked to exit their vehicle. They're more likely to be handcuffed. They're more likely to be sat on the curb. They're more likely to be searched. You know, and so when you look at although, albeit it happens for a relatively small portion of stops, there's also racial disparities in use of force as well, both you know, less lethal as well as lethal force. And so you see that the outcome, at least in terms of the treatment during the stops, there are clear patterns by race, ethnicity. But when you turn to the outcome of the stop, and I think this is something that the current report and last year's report focused increasingly on, as well as a recent study by the Public Policy Institute of California, that black stops are less likely to actually result in a citation or any action being taken. And you'll even see if you look at citation and a warning, this is a warning when there's no official citation, no arrest made, that tends to be more likely the case when you're looking at African American stops. Now, there's another interesting thing is when you're looking at the reason for a stop, a pattern that you see in California, and you also see it across the country, right, is that stops tend to be much more likely for equipment violations, for expired tags, so on and so forth, and less likely for a traffic violation in terms of the proportional composition of a stop. And then also you kind of see this constant pattern, and I've seen it in many research studies where you have this race disparity where the person is let go with a warning or nothing happens.
Now,
and go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, that they're let go with a warning and nothing happens is really an interesting concept, because your study also describes some of the mental health effects of having been stopped, or the threat of being stopped, or the information that your brother, cousin, neighbor, someone who looked like you was stopped. Oh, they were let go. But the warning wasn't just perceived by them as a warning to get your tag fixed or your mirror fixed or your whatever the condition of the car was. The feeling they generally have, and I'm speculating, but from my perception, is the thing that needs to be fixed is the color of your skin, and we ain't doing that. Policy-wise, your vision, your statistics that show the repetition of these acts despite your recommendations, how do they affect you as you looking at policy as a professor of public policy? When we look at this action that takes place, does it not represent to you the actual policing policy. And as we make the recommendations, and I'd like to go through some of those, that we're trying to change that police policy. And my next question kind of leans over toward my friend, Mr. Richardson, Attorney Richardson, is that if these things are actual policy and they are actual civil rights violations, should we not just be making recommendations? Should we not be referring this to, and you're right there with the California Justice Department, how does the Attorney General respond to the report in terms of his policy of movement?
Go ahead, Steve.
Sure. So it is the case that, basically all of the empirical analysis of the report is carried out by California Department of Justice statisticians and analysts. And the report, the staff are all Department of Justice employees. And so the goal here is to try to understand what's happening with the intent of trying to make recommendations that would help alleviate some of these things. And indeed, that ultimately involves policies adopted at the department level, right? So every law enforcement agency has a set of policies that guide what their officers can and can't do. And in fact, whenever there's a complaint or a question about whether there's questionable interaction or use of force and whether it violated civil rights, oftentimes the process is framed as, was the officer's action within or outside of policy? So, with that in mind, you could imagine, for example, like in the current report, there's a lot of discussion of pretextual stops. There are agencies across the country that have eliminated pretextual stops or said you stop people if there's public safety reason to stop them, either in the way they're driving or the condition of their vehicle or if they're committing a crime. And then there are other departments, for example, like LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, that recently adopted a policy that basically, allows for pretextual stops. But if somebody is going to make a pretextual stop, the officer has to turn their body camera on and articulate the reason for the stop into their body cam before they make it. And those are stops where you don't see someone speeding or running a red light or something like that.
He's got to
and trying to
that.
add a little bit more mindfulness into the process, I guess, and a little bit more thoughtful deliberation.
Describe
and so there
that
are lots
hunch.
of ways.
He's got to describe that hunch. He's got to tell us why he is pulling this person over, and how successful has that been. And there are other recommendations that have come about. How are the departments responding to that? I noticed that the city of the county of Riverside, for instance, and they were not the only one, actually had an increase in stops, and a significant increase in stops after the 2021 report. I don't know if that's because more people were in the street or whatever, but I do know that under those same conditions, the county of San Bernardino was reporting a reduction in stops. How do you respond to those numbers as they go up and go down? What do they mean to you guys as you analyze this?
Sure. Well, with regard to LA, so there is an evaluation research on that yet. There was a report in the LA Times where they had one of their data reporters do kind of an analysis of 7 months after, 7 months before that change. And it seemed to indicate that there was a substantial decline in stop activity. Whether or not it's attributable to policy, that probably requires more further research. But generally from year to year, especially the last few years, because the pandemic has really, we brought human activity almost to a halt in terms of outside the house or to a much diminished level. And we saw a lot of things decline, right? So not only stop activity, but, there were some crimes that declined quite drastically that are crimes that involve people interacting with one another, and others that rose, right, over that time period. But as we're returning back to something that's more akin to normal, although it doesn't seem we've returned to pre-pandemic levels, people working outside the home, there's just going to be more stops. There's going to be more of everything that is just almost a direct function of how much people are out of their house. So it's a little hard to look at the last few years and kind of just look at before and after stops and say attribute it to a policy or attribute it to how the officers are doing.
Does this report or this paperwork that the police now have to do when they pull someone over, do they complain about it? It seems to add a little more, another level of work, another level of paperwork. How do they respond to that, and what are their recommendations to you to make that report a little easier to make and take? Do they say it slows them down in doing what they do, or less protection as a result of this level of reporting?
So I wasn't around. I wasn't on the board when the initial regulations were promulgated and when the first form went out. But I remember the conversations at the time, and there were concerns about how much time it would take to fill out, so on and so forth. I think that for the most part, at least what we've seen in the last few years of the RIPA board, is that most of the departments figured out quite quickly how to incorporate the data gathering process. And for lots of stops, where there weren't a lot of complicated things that happened, there weren't too many boxes to check in terms of what happened, so it didn't take that much time. And in fact, I think there was a recent round of revisions that's going to add some questions that's going to streamline, that were aimed at trying to improve accuracy, in particular around use of force, because there appeared to be a high frequency of errors on that field because of the way that the data was structured. So we haven't, at least I have not heard a lot of complaints. The other thing that was interesting was the way RIPA was designed. Over I think it was 5 waves. It was going to start with all agencies with over 1,000 sworn officers, and then it went down to the next tier, and then the next tier, and the next tier before it encompasses everyone as it does now. And what we've seen every year is that there are departments that early adopted before they had to, and started reporting into the Department of Justice database. So even, for example, in the 2021 report, I think there's 58 of the largest agencies, which ends up covering most of the people in California. So we have a lot of small cities.
Well, they covered 3.1 million stops. I don't know what the total number of stops were, and I guess you don't either, since those other guys didn't report it. But let me ask you this. Are you surprised when you talk to people like me who are not surprised by the statistics? If I were to have a telepathic message from Dr. King right now, I'm sure he would say, it's the same way it was before, Wallace. What are we going to do about it? How do we stop this? It's not yours to totally answer this. It is yours, though, Stephen, to keep up the good work of the advisory board and keep pulling these statistics up. And even more important to a guy like me is that you make yourself available, as you've done, to discuss this. And I'm sure that we'll want to talk to you more about it. I'm going to spend the rest of the show talking to Attorney Richardson about the implications for people who are exposed to this report at a direct level, at the front end of it, because they've been pulled over. I want to thank you for your time, Professor Raphael, and we are going to get back to you, and thank you, and thank you, and thank you. This is Empire Talks Back. I'm Wallace Allen. We're going to take a short break. Happy Sunday to you, and a lot of people are going to have better lives because of the work you're doing. So, Stephen, again, thank you. We're going to take this short break and come back. And, Joe, I don't know, but as an attorney, we'll talk about it when we come back.
106.5 FM and KCAA 1050 AM.
I'm Dr. Erica Pond with the California Department of Public Health, reminding you of ways to help stop the spread of COVID and other viruses this winter. Boost your immunity by staying up to date with COVID boosters and flu shots. Wash your hands often with soap and warm water for at least 20 seconds. Cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze. And protect others by staying home and testing for COVID when sick. More tips at covid19.ca.gov. Brought to you by CDPH.
Publish your legal notice in West Side Story newspaper. For the best service and the best rates, call 909-384-8131. Publishing legal notices in the city and county of San Bernardino since 1990. West Side Story provides friendly expert service. Call 909-384-8131 to benefit from budget-friendly rates. Whether a fictitious business name, a name change, a divorce summons, or any other legal or public notice, call West Side Story newspaper 909-384-8131. 909-384-8131. That's 909-384-8131.
We're back. This is Empire Talks Back. I'm Wallace Allen. We just had a great discussion with Professor Stephen Raphael, co-chair of the California Identity and Racial Profiling Advisory Board. I'm sitting here with Attorney Joe Richardson of the McEwen Law Group here in San Bernardino area. Joe, you've read aspects of the report. You went through the discussion here. What's the first thing that sticks out for you as a civil rights attorney here?
Well, the proportion of stops, right? Black folks are stopped a lot more often, but a lot less comes out of them. The other proportion is that they're 2 times less likely. In other words, twice as much of the time, no result comes out of the stop. No citation, no ticket, no arrest. That means they're stopping people, black folks, for pretext, equipment violation, something like that, saying that they smell a rat as it pertains to something else, but maybe it's just that somebody's black and they felt like pulling them over. Well, and that's supported by the idea that not as much came out of the stops. So when they stop somebody white, it's more often to actually have a result, which means that it's less likely to be pretextual in the first place. In the discrimination area, we hate pretext because what we say in discrimination and employment discrimination, we say you have discriminated against this person. You fired them because they were black. You fired them because they were disabled. Then there's a shift of the burden that goes to the other side to say, no, I fired them because they were incompetent, because they did this or that and the other, because they lied, cheated, and stole. And then I'm supposed to show that what you are saying you fired them for, or what you did, or in this case, what the stop was for, was pretextual. In other words, you used something to get at something else when there wasn't necessarily anything there. The numbers seem to bear that out here.
And the search to find something,
that's right,
either was successful or unsuccessful. If it was unsuccessful, they tend to let them go, for which you get a big, I'm okay. But you're not okay.
Right, because you got pulled over when you shouldn't have.
And the emotional, and we didn't get into that with Steve today, but we will the next conversation, because they collected information about the emotional stress, the mental stress, the mental issues that take place as a result of this stop. It's not, the stop is over, but the mental anguish is not over.
Right.
The self-questioning is not over.
That's right.
As an attorney, have you been able at any point to deal with the emotional and mental issues that take place when a person has had their civil rights denied, or is it more of another level of evidencing that you need?
That's part of their damages, right? What they were put through because of the stop. But what you have to show, of course, is that the stop shouldn't have happened, or that once the stop did happen, things went too far in terms of what it is that was actually done. So,
what about just the stop, and he let me go, and it was, I don't know, how many times would I have to have that mental anguish? Maybe it may cause me to do something at my job and I lost my job that day. Or maybe it just screwed me up and I wasn't able to be a good husband that day. How much damage does a person have to have in order to try to turn this thing around, this pretextual, this opinionated, as opposed to facts fact-based policing?
Police get a lot of deference, okay? And if the police were equitable, okay, then it wouldn't be a problem, because people that put their lives on the line every day and do the things that they do, they ought to have some deference.
Absolutely.
But if they are irresponsible with that deference, that creates a problem. And there's always this notion of subjectivity. People can, we all have our biases. And so, the difference between a police officer, hopefully they've studied and they've done the things that they needed to do. But if they're biased and they have a gun and a badge and the benefit of the doubt, that's a little bit of a different situation than you or me having a bias, right? And so they can pull over folks. They can take two people that are doing the same thing or not, or that have the same equipment violation, and deal with them totally differently within the bounds of the law. I can't just say you wouldn't have pulled the white person over. I have to say, this is what you did to me, and so there was no reasonable suspicion, or there was no probable cause, or that you went too far. But when you say reasonable suspicion, well, what's reasonable? Yes. When you say probable cause, what's probable? And we've shown time and time again that that's subjective. Police, just like everybody else, have their pre-made biases, etc. when they come to a situation. That's why the black person gets pulled over twice as often.
And so we're dealing now with that result. That result being, can I sue? Should I sue? We've got people that say, oh, you're just suing to get the money. Well, it seems that suing the police has more of an effect on policy change than government policy initiated change. When we see them making multi-million-dollar settlements, the city making multi-million-dollar settlements because of a policeman's activity,
right?
That seems to catch people's attention a lot more than just the news that they pull Wallace over and they let him go again. But he's okay. Well, he's not okay.
A responsible agency or a responsible public servant will see that the police and the cities and the entities that are spending too much money on settlements, right? Some of the departments themselves, or elements in the departments, or maybe in the police union, would see that perhaps at worst as a cost of doing business. And so until police are personally liable, you're dealing with a qualified immunity issue and things like that, it might not change. But that being said, accountability is huge. You've got to have the right people in office that say, this is not good that we paid tens of millions of dollars last year in police settlements. We have to do something different. And so that means we have to change our policies, and we have to change our policies transparently so that people see it, so that we indicate a sea change.
Well, we have some people who are excellent police, excellent community folk that work in law enforcement, and for them to have their reputations tainted by a few people who exercise activities way outside of the law and maybe inside of policy. That's why the cities get sued, because the officer's acting within the policy. If he's not acting within policy, that's something else. Again, folks, we're about to get out of here. Quickest hour on radio. Joe, I appreciate you coming in.
Thanks,
and holding my hand as we go through this. Folks, if you got a legal issue, I'd recommend you give my friend Joe a call, especially if it's a civil rights deal. They are the McEwen Law Group.
Yeah, McEwen Law Group, McEwenWright.com, or just look up Attorney Joe Richardson. We'll pop right up.
Very good. All right, guys, have a great Martin Luther King birthday celebration. Go out and do something that you'd be proud of if Martin was standing there watching it. And he might be. I talk to him all the time. All right, guys. See you.
KCAA Loma Linda.